welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for our Equine Gastric Ulcer Syndrome webinar. Tonight we are joined by Dr. Katie Williams from Dengie and Tina Wallace. You may know her better as Life on the Left Rein. Before we get started, I'll just give you a bit of background about myself and SEIB Insurance Brokers. So I'm Katie. That's my boy Albie in the photo, in a very out of character photo shoot that we have done. But yeah, so I head up the marketing team at SEIB Insurance Brokers. Hopefully you're all aware of who SEIB are, but just for a bit of background, we're equestrian insurance specialists and we've been around for over 60 years now, and we will cover pretty much everything horse related. So your horse box, your trailer, your yard, your equestrian business. If you're a freelance groomer or instructor, we've got you covered. Next up, I'm going to be handing over to the lovely Tina Wallace, who is going to talk you through her lovely Mr. Banksy and his current ulcer claim.
So yes, unfortunately, I have recently had to make a claim because my boy has been poorly. He was showing some signs of ulcer-related distress, I would say. Back in August, he became very unhappy to be tacked up. To be fair, he's a sensitive chap, so he's always been a little bit girthy and a little bit like, especially in his stable. When we're out and about or at shows, or if he's tied up to the lorry, or if he's outside of his stable tacking up, he's always absolutely fine. But in his stable, he has always been a little bit sensitive. However, it got to become a lot more than that. He actually bit Emily's shoulder quite badly, my best friend. He got quite tail swishy when we were doing ridden work, tense in the canter. I was actually away at an event when the signs were like most prominent, and he was breaking back into trot from canter. And then when I got home, I thought I'll just take him for a little mooch, see if he's himself out hacking, because he loves a hack. He's always very jolly and very forward and very let's go on a hack. And I literally just took him down the lane behind my house, and on a loose rein, he turned round and went to go home. And instantly I was just like, this was the Monday after we got back, where I was like, this is not my horse. I need to get him checked over. And thankfully I managed to arrange for my vets, or a new vets actually. They weren't my original vets, but I heard that they had the equipment to enable them to do scoping, because I was quite intuitive with him and I sort of know him inside out, and I knew that these were signs he was showing that he was unhappy in his tummy. So I heard that this vets had the equipment to enable them to do the scoping process at home. So I spoke to them on the Tuesday, they came out on the Thursday, and yeah, they did the scope, which actually isn't as daunting as I was led to believe. I think it is intrusive, obviously, but actually my horse is a stressy and sensitive horse, and he was absolutely fine with it. So I think lots of people are potentially put off by scoping because of hearing stories of it not being that nice for the horses, but actually it's important that we do get there and get inside them and see it. You know, we've got the ability to be able to do it, so find out exactly what we're dealing with. And thankfully, although he was diagnosed with ulcers, it was only low grade 1 in the squamous region, and he did also have some inflammation, not even bad, but he had some inflammation in the area that I believe is slightly harder to treat, the pylorus ulcers. So we obviously, thankfully, he is insured with SEIB, so he has full cover, and they've been brilliant from the get-go. Very reassuring to know that he would have all the treatment and help that he needed to get him healthy again. And yeah, everybody, whenever I've dealt with them, from getting the quote to claiming, I've had my horse 10 years and never really had to make any form of claim on insurance at all. So it's always quite daunting making those phone calls and thinking, oh, do I, don't I? But yeah, everybody there was so helpful and so understanding. And yeah, they've been really good in helping get him on the mend. He's been having the sucralfate in his feed in order to help with his recovery. So he has that twice daily, omeprazole as well, along with some additional supplements prescribed by the vets. And then we've been doing some other things in his routine to assist, which I'm actually doing with my new horse now too, just to aid or prevent prevention rather than cure, isn't it, that they say? So yeah, we're making sure that both horses are fed chaff 30 minutes prior to any form of exercise and also travel. And I think for me that was a big one, and one that I probably would have never thought to do, because I travel my horses a lot living in Cornwall. To go to train or event, it always does include having to have a long journey. So I think that's one of the biggest things I've taken away from this, is how important it is having the fibre in their tummy and making sure that, I don't want to go into the technological terms because I'm not a vet, but making sure that the acid doesn't splash up into the area that is delicate and does react. And yeah, I think it has already made a massive difference. Obviously the treatment has, but also doing the things to prevent anything coming back or reoccurring again. Another thing that the vets advised, as did nutritionists, was that make sure that he's always got access to ad lib hay or haylage. So as the grass at the moment obviously isn't as good as it is in the summer, it's I always make sure now that he has either a pile of hay in the field or a hay net on the fence, so that he's got access to it should he need it during the day when he's out as well.
Thanks, Tina. It's really helpful that you're using your platform to talk about this, just so other people know what it's really like and what they can do to help their horses. And also thank you for your kind words about our claims team. They work really hard to try and be there as much as possible for people going through claims. We're all horse owners, we know how stressful it can be, and our team really do try and go the extra mile to make it as stress-free as possible. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, they've all been so lovely and so helpful and so reassuring. And it's the fact that you don't, they'll email, they don't just talk to you on the phone, they'll be like, oh, pop that through on an email to clarify that for you and stuff like that. So no, they've been really, really helpful and made things go very smoothly.
Brilliant, I'm pleased to hear it. So now we're going to hand over to Dr. Katie Williams from Dengie Horse Feeds, who is going to talk us through the ins and outs of feeding horses with ulcers.
Screen really is just to highlight a couple of things, in the sense that as a registered nutritionist, that is with the Association for Nutrition, and it is primarily actually a human nutritionist organisation, but they do recognise animal nutritionists as well. So that's an independent assessment of an individual's sort of capability, and there is a code of conduct. So not that I wouldn't anyway, but it's just to offer some peace of mind and reassurance that we're always having the horse's welfare uppermost in our thoughts, and our advice and guidance reflects that. Also particularly relevant, I think, to this evening is that I am the chair of the EGUS approval mark, which is from the British Equestrian Trade Association, so BETA. You might have heard of them before. They also do things like NOPS schemes, which is prohibited substances. They also do safety, so hat and body protectors. So I'm sure they're an organisation that you're familiar with. But I want to just explain a little bit more about how the approval mark works and what sort of products can be approved. And again, just to reiterate its independence and its assessment of various products. And lastly on this slide, really just to highlight that whilst nutrition is very much a sort of science-based endeavour, shall we say, then the actual practical application of that, the feeding side, is very much an art. And I still maintain that biology is the hardest of all the sciences, because there is so much individuality, so much variance between and within individuals, that actually trying to find something that works for every single horse or pony is very much an art. And it's knowing your horse. I think, as Tina just alluded to, she knew her horse. She's very in tune with him and what's normal for him, and when there's a sign of a problem, that's when, as horse owners, we tend to want to get our veterinary support involved to help sort those issues out. So we're going to try and cover some science-based issues relating to ulcers, dispel some of the myths, but also give you some practical sort of feeding tips and advice, which is much more the art of it. So without further ado, and I think in Banksy's case, he actually had ulcers in both of the regions of the horse's stomach, but this is really a key point. And I think one of the key messages from this evening, and Tina really nicely put it in the in her presentation already, that actually the sort of issues in the glandular region, or in his case, the pyloric region or the pylorus, is actually much more now thought of as being an inflammatory disease rather than a sort of ulcerative one. So we'll explore what that means as we go through in a bit more detail. But essentially, your horse can have both types of issue in the two different regions of the stomach. They might not actually in fact be related, although obviously in many cases they do seem to have a similar sort of underlying cause or issue. But it's the squamous region is that sort of creamy looking area on the image. It's the top half of the horse's stomach as we look at it, and it doesn't have that sort of built-in protection against the really acidic contents that are generating or coming from the bottom glandular region of that stomach. So Tina mentioned the splash effect, and it's basically when the stomach is empty and the horse is moving, all the contents of that glandular region can splash up or move around in the horse's stomach. So that basic having that fibrous mat, so feeding before you exercise or travel, is really to try and stop that acid splash effect. Now, I'm not going to go into lots of detail because there's loads of information already about the sort of risk factors and issues relating to gastric ulcers. I want to focus in, because again, we're sort of going to keep fairly tight to time this evening, but focus in on sort of 3 commonly asked questions relating to forage specifically for horses prone to ulcers. So can I safely feed straw? Can I safely feed haylage? And can I safely feed alfalfa? So they're the 3 things that we're going to focus in on. But before we get to that, I really want to, and this is crucial and key and a really fundamental point, I want to explore how much is enough when we're thinking about forage and balancing things like weight management and the risk of ulcers. And I should say, if you do have questions as we're going through, I think there's a chat facility. Please do pop them in there. We'll have some time for some questions at the end. And if there are any that are a bit more detailed or need a bit more time, then I'm more than happy to sort of talk to people tomorrow or follow up later in the week. But this was the survey we did actually back in 2021, and I think probably the pandemic helped increase survey responses quite considerably, because we actually got 650 people who completed the survey. It was run in conjunction with Horse and Hound on their sort of online platforms. And we were asking people that had overweight horses about the reasons why they find it hard to keep their horse at a healthy weight. What are the challenges? Where are those dilemmas? And actually, the one that really sort of struck a chord, and we had noticed in our sort of communications with horse owners, whether it's on yards or on the feed line, that this was a recurring theme. And it's people worrying about not feeding enough forage, to the point where their horse might get ulcers or other issues like colic, but in the process of making sure they're getting enough or putting enough forage into their horse, it's actually contributing to the weight issue. So in other words, these horses are becoming obese or overweight. So those sorts of things are areas where you start to see trends. You think, okay, there's a real need here. People are sort of struggling to work out, how much is enough, but not too much that we get a further issue with weight gain and obesity, and then potentially laminitis. So what does the research and the literature tell us about this? Well, I think it's quite interesting that since ulcers has become much more more people are aware of ulcers, and the sort of prevalence of it is obviously more than 50%, in some cases more like 80 to 90% if we're looking at racehorse populations, then because we understand how significant and how high risk our horses are for things like ulcers, we're actually starting to see the literature reflect that. So over the last sort of 10-15 years, really, we've gone from the minimum recommended intake moving from around 1% of body weight to more recently a minimum of 1.5% of body weight on a dry matter basis. Now, that's the consensus statement from Rendell et al. So they're looking very much in the context of things like EMS and weight management. if you are working with your vet, and if your vet feels that the horse's weight has plateaued and that you need to go below that level to facilitate further weight loss, that's very much a conversation to have with your vet. But the aim should always be to try and get back to 1.5% as soon as you can. And that's when we think about the long-term management and the health of our horses, because any time where you are reducing below 1.5%, you are certainly starting to increase the risk of other issues. Now, in this context, short term is around about 12 weeks, and it's actually what is considered short term in human nutrition terms as well. So anything under basically 3 months, you know, with supervision and discussion with your vet, if you need to go that low, then you can go below 1.5%. But as I say, the kind of aim should always be to try and get back to 1.5% on a dry matter basis as soon as you can, and certainly when we're considering the long-term management of a good doer. Now, obviously, if your horse is putting on weight and you're struggling with weight gain or obesity, we can actually feed more if we use lower calorie forages, and that is really where things like straw come into play. And I think it's so sad that straw is labelled as something that you can't use for horses with ulcers, because if you have a good doer, it is actually a really useful ingredient for providing plenty of fibre, for plenty of chew time, plenty of saliva production as a result of all that chewing, and all of which are really going to help reduce the risk of ulcers. So where do the concerns or the myths about straw come from? And it really dates back to one study that was done in 2009, and Nana Lutherson and colleagues are based in Scandinavia. And in those countries, the Scandinavian countries, generally, straw is used at much, much higher levels as a source of forage. So what they found in doing this sort of review of the risk factors for ulcers is that when straw was the sole or the majority form of forage that horses were given, there was an increased risk of ulcers. Now, it wasn't causation, so it wasn't if you feed straw at this level, your horse is going to get ulcers. It is all about an increased risk. And it was when the straw was used as the sole or majority forage. That's including pasture, hay, haylage. So it wasn't just because it was in the bucket feed at a high level. It had to be at least half of the ration, if not more. So I really think that it's sad that that one paper gets taken completely out of context. And fortunately, we've had some subsequent work done by Janssen et al., which was published in 2021. And they were specifically looking to see whether the addition of 50% wheat straw, if they replaced haylage with that, whether there was any increased risk of ulcers. And they were looking for ulcers specifically in that study. Now, they actually didn't find any associated risk from feeding up to 50% wheat straw. The reason they use wheat is that not a lot of oats are grown in Scandinavia, so that's the straw they have there. It's the straw that's typically used, and so that's what they fed. Now, in the UK, we tend to prefer to use oat straw if it's available. Wheat straw or barley straw are other options, and I'm probably preempting some of my later slides, but it doesn't really matter which straw you use, as long as you introduce it gradually, and we'll come to that in more detail in a minute. What was really interesting from my perspective in this Janssen study, and if any of you do have horses that have got insulin dysregulation for whatever reason, whether it's PPID or EMS, when they put straw in with the haylage, it actually slowed the rate of intake. So these horses took so long to eat their forage that there was no real sort of response in terms of things like insulin to that feed. So in other words, when a horse eats normally, we see a rise in glucose, and we see the rise in insulin to control that glucose or regulate that glucose, and that's what we call as a glycemic or an insulinemic response. And in a horse that's insulin dysregulated, that all gets out of kilter, and in some cases you can get a really extreme or exaggerated insulinemic response. Now, because this wasn't basically a meal, it was the horse trickle feeding as he should, as nature intended, and the rate of intake was so slow because of the inclusion of straw, there was basically no discernible response to the horse's eating. And I think that's so useful if we are basically trying to manage horses with any form of insulin dysregulation. And I'll talk more about that in the context of the bucket feed in a minute as well. So just some numbers to give you some context to how useful it is if we can actually replace some of our hay or haylage with straw. So if we take an average UK hay, this is hay, and we replace it with around third of straw, it can actually amount to about a 16% reduction in energy or calories. So it stands to reason if we're using better quality forages, so things like haylage tend to be more digestible, and if we go up to 50% of the forage ration being replaced with straw, then that energy or calorie intake could be reduced by as much as a quarter. And that is really significant when we're trying to facilitate weight loss, especially in horses that might have plateaued. We've done as much as we can to get the weight off, but those last, say, 20-30 kilos, they won't budge. Then this could be a really useful tool in your armoury to try and facilitate further weight loss. There is more information in the trials that we've done where we replaced some of the forage with straw, and actually, rather excitingly, we've just had it published in the Journal of Equine Veterinary Science, so that's really exciting. But we've also actually, when we did the trials, found that there was much more sorting behaviour, and it's as much that the horse picking through the straw and the forage combined that actually slows the rate of intake. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning how much horses can vary between individuals and within their own sort of behaviours, and this was very apparent. So some of these horses, when they had straw mixed in with their forage, it didn't really put them off at all. They just still kept chewing, and it didn't really matter what was going on around them. They put their head to the hay net and they didn't stop. And then there are others that are much more sensitive to what's going on the yard, so they might chew a bit, come to the stable door. So there is obviously some individual variability in their response to the forage that we're giving, but overall, across a broader population, then certainly the addition of straw will give you sort of more sorting behaviour and actually slow the rate of intake really significantly. So I mentioned that we'd look at straw in the bucket feed as well, and this I find really interesting because this was in horses that did have insulin dysregulation already. So this study by Erica Macon and colleagues, published a couple of years ago, and what they actually found was when they used equivalent to effectively a balancer and put it in the bucket for these horses as a sort of meal feed, so they weren't particularly slow in consuming it. It was pretty normal eating in around 10 minutes their whole ration of this balancer. They actually saw a really exaggerated insulinemic response. Now, it's important to stress this is in insulin dysregulated horses, so it doesn't mean that balancers aren't safe for other horses, but it's just something to bear in mind that when we are feeding even something that we can see to be sort of relatively safe in the form of a balancer, so it's low in starch, it's low in sugar relative to other feeds, but even still in that scenario, because they ate it quite quickly, there was still a response to that meal feed. So anything we can do to slow them down when we're using a balancer, and again, I wouldn't say not to use a balancer, it's very important to balance the ration. We just need to make it take as long as we possibly can for those horses to eat it. And that's why, again, I would advocate for using chopped fibres such as straw in the bucket feed to slow that rate of intake. We fixate quite a lot generally on things like the NSC content, and you'll hear this, like we've got to be 10 to 12% NSC, but the sort of second half of that conversation, or where we should go with that, is to think about how quickly those horses are eating it. So it's not just what we're putting in, it's how they eat it as well. And just to reassure you, I suppose, that if you have concerns about using straw, that it is a commonly used ingredient in feeds and it has been used for decades. The key is obviously to introduce and increase it gradually. If you have a horse with a history of impaction colics, dental issues, then obviously, it might not be for them and you really should be discussing it with your vet. But for the vast majority of horses with good dentition, able to chew, you can use it in moderation, introduce it gradually. It's just as safe as any other form of forage. Now, I mentioned that oat straw is normally the first choice. I think it's really interesting that the Donkey Sanctuary, who use a lot of straw for precisely these reasons, they actually tend to use wheat and barley because the oat straw is actually too conditioning for the donkeys. You can soak and steam straw if you want to, if you have respiratory or hygienic concerns. If you are competing under rules, just be aware of the potential for weeds and therefore the NOPS risk if you're buying your straw locally. But I think overall, for the vast majority of horses, and when we're thinking about these really good doers, where we want to provide enough fibre to reduce the risk of ulcers, maintain gut health, etc., but not promote further weight gain, it's a really valuable ingredient. So moving on to question number 2, can I safely use haylage? And my slightly flippant response for this is usually, first thing to establish is actually, is it a true haylage? Are we actually talking about a haylage? And my reason for highlighting that, and this table, I'm sorry if it looks a bit complicated or if you're on a small screen, I'm more than happy to send slides to people if you'd like them. But the reason for asking, is it a true haylage, is really, has any fermentation occurred? Now, we know that ulcers is associated with increased levels of acidity if we feed high levels of cereal-based feeds. We haven't got enough buffering coming from saliva and forages and things, and so the stomach can become more acidic. So, of course, we wouldn't want to then put an acidic forage back into to potentially exacerbate the problem. But the key is, do we know if it is actually an acidic forage? Because increasingly, for lots of reasons, very valid reasons, our so-called sort of haylages, which are really just basically anything wrapped in plastic, they aren't actually fermented. So we tend to find that people are making drier forages, getting them to a certain point, probably around 70+% dry matter, wrapping them in plastic. And so, yes, it preserves them or conserves them, but there's not enough moisture for it to actually ferment. So you're effectively just stopping the air getting to that forage, so that's why it doesn't deteriorate, but you're not actually pickling it through the fermentation process in the way that a traditional silage or haylage would actually be effectively pickled. It will still smell sort of lovely and sweet, but it's not necessarily a fermented forage smell. And if you do get a chance to smell a true haylage or even silage, you will notice the degree of difference between something that's a wrapped hay versus a haylage. The thing to be aware of, incidentally, if you do have wrapped hay, is once you open it, so as soon as you break that plastic, it isn't going to be as stable as a truly fermented product. So that's just something to be aware of. If it's a small bale and you're using it quickly, that's fine, but it will have a pretty limited shelf life once it's opened. Now, if we haven't got that fermentation, what have we got? And I think the sort of table here is really trying to show you how things are sort of effectively a better definition of a wrapped forage would actually be a wrapped hay. Because if you look at the sort of nutritional profile of it, it really is more similar to a traditional sort of hay than it is things like the haylage or the silage. So the yellow and green columns are data from the samples that we've analysed here at Dengie in recent years, and then the sort of bluey grey columns all relate to data that came from Muller and Udom. Which the reason that's a useful study is that all of those forages in the grey and blue columns were actually taken from the same field. So on the same day, they took different parts of the field, made some into hay, some into haylage and some into silage. So we're trying to control for variables like the field and the climate and the weather conditions, because when we're comparing and contrasting different forages, obviously there are so many variables that come into play. So you can see that with the silage, which has a really low dry matter, so it's only 30% of material, the rest of it is water, there was a lot of fermentation, and we used in this example the lactic acid. So that's your marker of fermentation. If the forage ferments, you're going to get acid produced, and that's what stabilizes it. And you can see the level is really quite high. As soon as we start to dry that forage, then we actually reduce the amount of fermentation. So there's still a little bit going on in this true haylage. We've got around 2.6 grams per kilo, which is much lower than the silage, but there is still some fermentation going on, and therefore that haylage will be a bit acidic, but certainly not as much as the silage would be. When we get to the data that we've collated from the wrapped hay samples that we've analysed, then you can see the dry matter is 77.8 on average, so it's well over where we would expect a haylage to be, at around sort of 55, maybe 60%, and that's why it's not fermenting. And you can see that the WSC, so the sugar levels, the storage sugar is still there, it hasn't been fermented, and there's hardly any lactic acid, which is your marker of fermentation. So it's closer to the hay than it would be the haylage and silage. I would suggest that for all of those reasons, there isn't any reason to not use a wrapped hay. If you've done the analysis to check, then and you haven't got that higher level of acidity, there's no reason not to use a wrapped hay for ulcers. And I'm sorry, I think that's probably dropped off the bottom of that slide bit, but we do offer a forage analysis service. We only charge what the lab charge us. So if you want to take advantage of that, and a pH or an acidity test is relatively cost effective to do, and it's well worth looking at if there are reasons that you would like to use a wrapped forage for your horse that's prone to ulcers. Now, I've dropped this slide in because I just think it's another example from a published study where, and in this context, unfortunately, haylage was being sort of blamed for resulting in a sort of more insulinemic response. But when you look at the water-soluble carbohydrate levels, that WSC, I don't think it's got anything to do with the conservation technique used. It's actually just a simple fact that it's much higher in WSC. So again, I think a more accurate sort of definition or description of that forage would have been a wrapped hay, which I think would have given us a much more informed understanding of what was going on and why that forage was having an impact on those horses that it was fed to. And I think this is one of the challenges with haylages and forages, is that people that do the trials and do the studies don't necessarily look for that extra detail. You know, has this actually fermented? Is it the fermentation that we need to be worried about, or is it just simply that it's actually got a high sugar content? And why would I want to use a wrapped hay? Well, less drying time is needed in the field. So if you're making your own forage, it can be more convenient if you're under time pressure. It tends to be harvested earlier, which means it's more digestible. So the younger the plants are when we cut them and harvest them, the more digestible they tend to be. So a late cut forage will be typically much more fibrous and typically lower in energy. So they tend to be a little bit more conditioning and therefore useful for the poorer doer or those that might need a bit more energy for work. And the more reliance we can put onto forage, the greater contribution it's making to the horse's requirements, the less reliance there is on any sort of cereal-based feed. You know, and there's increasing evidence, which I'll come to at the end, for horses being able to work at really quite high levels on fibre-based rations. So as long as it's good quality fibre, and the emphasis certainly on that. It tends to be more palatable for fussier horses. So again, if you've got something that's quite fit in harder work and you want to tempt them to eat, sometimes a nice sort of wrapped hay is a better, more tasty option for them. And obviously it's more convenient to store. If you do have a good doer, then you can potentially mix it with straw if you need to dilute it. So if you're limited for space on your yard or livery yard or whatever, then you can use a wrapped hay, but potentially mix it with straw to get the balance right for your horse. And then the third sort of key point really is, can I safely use alfalfa? And I suppose if we go back to the early 2000s now, that was when the benefits of alfalfa were really first identified, and largely in the US, where they tend to use alfalfa in a hay form. Not exclusively, but the majority of them would be using an alfalfa hay. And the researchers at the time were attributing its benefits because it is a natural buffer due to its levels of calcium, magnesium and protein, and those act as natural buffers in the horse's stomach. So over and above a grass-based forage, you were getting more natural buffering. And at that time, it's quite amusing when you look at the advice given, because it was, well, you're still feeding your starchy cereals, but if you're going to do that, then put some alfalfa in. I think we've moved on a bit to say try and take your cereals out in the first place, and use much more sort of fibre to supply your energy. But obviously some horses are still going to need some form of cereal-based feed if they're working at really high levels, and so even if it's a perceived need, then the application is still there for adding alfalfa alongside if you want some natural buffering. Now, as I mentioned, there is increasing evidence to show that alfalfa is actually a good energy source in its own right, and it's fueling horses at a really high level of work. And I think a lot of people forget that actually alfalfa in its own right is around 10 megajoules, which is of DE per kilo, which is equivalent to a sort of cool mix high fibre cube sort of energy level. So it is a really valuable source of energy for working horses as well. So why does alfalfa have such high levels of calcium? Well, it has a really deep root system, and as you can see from the sort of image there, Those roots will go down 3 to 4 meters, which is a much deeper root structure than things like corn and soybean. And that far down, the minerals in the sort of soil are much easier for the plant to take up. And that's why with those long tap roots going that far down, it can actually get access to nutrients that other plants aren't reaching, and it's much easier for them to absorb it as well. And I think, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it is a great plant from a sustainability perspective. It's the reason that the growers at Dengie use it as part of their crop rotation, because all that soil structure is helping to improve all that root structure is helping to improve soil quality, and it's certainly putting organic matter back into the soil, which is again helpful for sort of things like carbon capture, carbon sinks, and alfalfa stays in the ground for at least 3 to 4 years. So it is minimum till and no till for a relatively long period of time compared to annual crops. So it's why people like the French government are funding lots of research to find uses and make the case for utilising alfalfa as an ingredient, because it's a much better plant to be growing for sustainability reasons. And the other thing I would say about all those roots is that alfalfa is quite unique in the sense that any surplus sugar, because all plants will photosynthesize if there's enough light, they will make sugar. If they've got obviously the various components to photosynthesize, like water, you need the chlorophyll in the plant itself and the sunlight, and that will start to produce sugar. So in contrast to other plants, if alfalfa has got a surplus of sugar that it doesn't need for actually growing itself, it will put it as starch, but it puts it into its roots, and they're the bits that the horses don't eat. So they're left underground. So the plant above ground is actually naturally very low in starch and sugar, and it's one of the reasons it makes a really useful ingredient, because it's giving us fibre and good quality protein, but it isn't giving us sugar and starch. So why is low starch important? Well, this was some independent work which was funded by the French government, actually looking at the use of alfalfa in racehorses in training in France. So Samy Julian and colleagues at the Lab to Field Research Organisation based in Dijon are continuing to do more work, but this particular study was looking at the glandular gastric disease in horses, so the EGGD, or the ulcers or inflammation in the pyloric region. And they actually found a lower prevalence of ulcers in horses fed a 50-50 combination of alfalfa pellets in their concentrate ration. And these are real standard-bred horses in training, and the reason they chose in this case the alfalfa pellets was because it was something that the animals were much more used to eating, and so it wasn't such a big transition. Because you imagine 50% of their ration in chopped fibre form would be really quite a significant volume. They are doing that follow-up study, so it's not that they didn't want to look at it, it's just incremental steps. So they started with pellets because that's what the horses were more familiar with. The diet was basically I suppose effective is the right word, even though the level of starch when they were feeding 50% alfalfa still exceeded the recommendations. So it wasn't just that they'd taken all the starch out completely, they were still having some starchy based feed in there at levels above what we would normally recommend. But the alfalfa had a protective effect even when that amount of starch was actually used. Now, I would always advocate to get the starch lower, but this is a sort of research study, so it's really quite a powerful finding. If you are interested in how much starch your horse is consuming, we have a starch calculator on our website, and you can just put in, you just basically need to know the percentage of starch and what you're feeding, and then you can or find out how much starch that's actually providing per meal and per day if you'd rather not do the maths yourself. So Sammy's conclusion from that study was that findings demonstrated that clinical success was 47.7 times more likely when part of the concentrate ration was replaced with alfalfa, which in itself is not a particularly startling revelation, because if you're taking starch out and putting fibre in, you're likely to have success. The key bit was the level of starch that was still in the ration, in my opinion. And I suppose, again, somewhat flippantly, my question would be, but what if alfalfa could fuel those horses without having to use that level of starch? And some of the follow-up work, and this has actually been published in the Frontiers of Exercise Physiology journal, and this was looking at alfalfa and the impact it has on energy metabolism in these horses. So we know from previous work, that's, gosh, over 10 years old now, that if we actually put the good quality fibre in, then if it's there, the horse will make use of it as an energy source. So VFA there stands for volatile fatty acids. That's the end product of what you get when you ferment fibre in the horse, not in the like the forage situation. You put the fibre in, the horse ferments it, it gets the volatile fatty acids as an energy source to use. And if it's there in the horse, they will use it. Now we've seen that previously, as I say, sort of 2012, that first study was carried out, but that study just did a standard exercise test and actually looked at one point in time, basically. So it gives you a snapshot. It's not looking at what the impact of doing that might be over the longer term. And Martin et al., which is part of Sammy's research group at Lab to Field in Dijon, have just recently published a study where they were looking at the longer term effects. So they actually fed these racehorses for 8 weeks with those higher levels of alfalfa based forages and reducing the cereals right down. So this is really interesting from a real world application. And again, there was still some cereal in there, because I think we've got to accept that racehorses are going to, and trainers are going to want to feed some level of starch. And this is real life racehorses rather than research horses where the study was being done. I mean, that does have some downsides in that it's much harder to control some of the variables, but nevertheless, they actually used 68% grass hay and 32% oats as the sort of control ration, and then in the trial ration they brought in the alfalfa and reduced the oats right down to just 7%. So that amounted to about 4 kilos of alfalfa and 1 kilo of oats. To put that into context, it was a mix of chopped alfalfa and pelleted alfalfa. If we were going to do well, basically a scoop, a good heaped scoop of chopped alfalfa would be about 500 grams, the stub scoop. So that gives you some idea of the sort of volume. So again, using a combination of chopped alfalfa and pelleted alfalfa helps to make it manageable and a level that is practical for the yard to use and a level that the horses will eat. Both diets were formulated to meet 100% of the energy requirements for horses in heavy work, inevitably because of the natural abundance of quality protein in alfalfa, you're going to get a little bit more protein from that ration, but that's where it becomes very difficult to keep everything matched completely. But in this context, it was most important to match energy values. So what did they find? Well, the study showed that actually higher fibre rations were not hindering performance, and in fact may even have had some metabolic benefits. Now, there is evidence that the type of forage matters. The previous work used haylage rather than high quality fibre in the bucket. So, you know, we need to make sure that what we're putting in is really good quality. You're not going to get these sorts of results if you're using predominantly things like straw or a timothy hay, for example. And I suppose in my mind, the fact that we matched those horses' performance with alfalfa is really important. Yes, okay, it might not have been superior performance, but that doesn't matter. We just want to show that these forage-based rations are not compromising performance. So for me, that's a win, even though at first glance it might not look like there was some benefit from doing it. We just matched it. That's progress. And you could argue, I suppose, that some of these chopped fibre or pelleted fibre ways of fueling horses will negate some of the impacts that get sort of, I suppose, discussed when you're using a forage-based ration. The idea is that you're going to have this increased sort of gut fill or a sort of hay belly appearance. There's extra weight because it sits in the gut for longer, and this is perhaps more something that trainers focus on, but it still has relevance to any sort of performance horse where you might be thinking, I don't really want their hind gut full of lots of sort of indigestible material, but actually it does seem to negate some of the impacts of that. If you were using a grass-based forage that isn't as digestible, you are going to have more gut fill, whereas if you do a combination of good quality haylages and digestible fibres like alfalfa and sugar beet that are easily broken down, then you're getting the benefits of energy, fibre, and very little starch from those different ingredients. And there are so many other benefits from high fibre diets, such as ulcer risk reduction. We're also seeing that relationship between the microbiota, the behaviour, the immune response, and overall gut health. So anything we can do to make the gut healthier, has got to be a good thing. And I would argue, even in the elite performance horse, all of these things are so crucial to how well, not only how well they perform on the day, but also then their recovery, their ability to bounce back from competition, etc. So to sort of round off some of the information relating to EGGD, there's been a nice review recently, really trying to evaluate the sort of risk factors and a bit of a meta-analysis of what we actually know so far. So by Bantz and Andrews, they looked at the 3 studies specifically evaluating management factors associated with EGGD. And they found dietary factors seem to be much less important for the control of EGGD when compared to ESGD. But the same sorts of things, so things like reduced pasture turnout, increased grain concentrates, which probably go hand in hand with things like increased exercise as well. Trying to avoid those is obviously sensible, and there does seem to be some correlation there as well. But whereas all of these good practices that we talk about repeatedly for the squamous issues are really well established as reducing the risk, there's much less clear-cut sort of correlations or relationships between what we can do when it comes to EGGD. And that certainly reflects the consensus statement from veterinary organisations such as the European College of Equine Internal Medicine. I think we're going to see a lot more discussion on EGGD, not least because I think Tina mentioned it at the beginning as well, that they can be very difficult to heal and treat in lots of cases. And this slide and these notes were really from a recent veterinary vet PD webinar, actually, where there were 3 or 4 researchers from all around the world discussing those cases of EGGD that are very difficult to treat and manage. So they actually had these images of the top ones are much more your sort of inflammatory looking red, but the bottom image is the ones that are really particularly difficult to treat, and they're the ones that are being defined as nodular. And I think that there's pretty much consensus in the veterinary profession now that you're not going to grade the EGGD on the 1 to 4 scales like you would for the squamous issues. I think we're going to see much more definitions or I suppose descriptions of these issues as raised or nodular or flat and hemorrhagic. Those flat sort of hemorrhagic ones were much more likely to heal within 28 days. So, and I thought it was interesting, and this was very much an anecdotal comment from the vets, if in their experience with racehorses, if they had EGGD, it was much more likely to have the flat form. And so therefore I would suggest probably slightly more sort of closely related to the issues in the squamous area of the stomach, and therefore more likely to heal with good practices and treatment. It's these nodular ones that I think will probably get a different etiology, perhaps even a different name in due course. So we're going to be seeing these sort of areas develop. And again, I was lucky enough to go to the International Colic Conference earlier this year. And there were 2 studies presented, actually. So the Charbin et al. One that you can see on the screen now, this is actually published work, but there was a second research group from the Netherlands, again, a veterinary hospital, doing a very similar study to this. So they were just scoping these horses periodically throughout the calendar year, which obviously is slightly different in terms of the academic year, but at different times where these horses and ponies would be exposed to different levels of numbers of people handling them, the sorts of things that they would be utilised for, and then they might have complete downtime over the summer where they're turned out and not handled very much at all, kind of rest periods. And both of these university hospitals are tracking the incidence of things like EGGD throughout the year and correlating it with the level of perceived stress. So what I think is really interesting from the Charbin published quote is that the disease might improve, worsen, or even resolve over time without medical intervention. Risk factors that can be attributed at the individual level need to be acknowledged. In this environment, breed, number of handlers, hierarchy, and stress were relevant. So I think, again, it's very important to keep in mind that correlation doesn't mean causation, but it's highly likely that stress is a significant risk factor. Now, how we define stress will vary, but certainly things like numbers of handlers, noise, time away from their friends, all those sorts of things can be considered to be stress. And this same pattern, again, anecdotal because it's not published yet, they were only a few months in, but in conversation they were talking about the fact that in Holland, in the study that they're doing, they're seeing exactly the same. So I think, you know, we're just scratching the surface of how stress might be impacting our horses, and even whether that incidence or prevalence is something we should be worried about. If there are no clinical signs, these horses are, you know, very well managed, they're kept in a veterinary hospital. If there's no outwardly obvious sort of sign of an issue, and you're looking and you're finding it, you know, what does that tell us? I think we have to keep in mind the clinical significance of these issues when we go looking for them. So I think with all of that in our minds, we have to be really careful when we look at some of the studies and some of the misinformation that gets perpetuated, sadly, on social media. And I'm not anti-social media, because it's a great tool for disseminating lots of positive and valuable information. But when we come to things like alfalfa, you know, there haven't been any negative effects in relation to ulcers in the squamous region in horses of any age, and there are multiple positive studies. The only negative finding to date is in weaned foals, so therefore stressed foals. It was in the pyloric region only, and I think it's also worth noting that the incidence of ulcers in those foals was very high even before they started to do the study. But they were fed much higher levels of alfalfa chaff than would typically be used, as well as high levels of oats. And I think at the time, the study is now over 10 years old, probably the role of stress was perhaps considered less relevant. And I don't think that was included in the discussion or even considered necessarily. And given that we're seeing this shift in EGGD being viewed as an inflammatory disease, not an ulcerative one, and that stress can trigger it, it can also go, you know, they didn't follow up and look at those foals in another 3 weeks to see if once they'd got over weaning, the EGGD issues had gone away again. So I think there's some questions very much from that study, and it is only one study at the end of the day. So I think the take-home message in relation to EGG generally is that if that chronic stressful situation isn't removed or resolved, then basically the cause isn't going away, and therefore however much treatment we give, there's every probability we're not going to see the improvement in the clinical situation. And that, I think, is why a lot of them can be very difficult to treat. And, you know, we have to have some really also ask ourselves some really difficult questions if that's the scenario that we're faced with. If we've tried medications and the issue isn't resolving, you know, how far do we go in trying to reduce our horse's stress? And I, for one, know how difficult it can be difficult to find the right yard for your horse. You know, if you want to compete and travel and all that, you know, it's some really sort of difficult dilemmas that we're faced with. So the consensus statement for EGGD is certainly to try and reduce stress by giving a minimum of 2 rest days from work per week, if that's possible, or provide regular rest periods. I'm conscious of time, but I will just do a little anecdotal insight from some stud managers and trainers that I was chatting to over the summer, and many of them had spent time in Australia, and their racing calendar is actually quite different to the UK in that these horses go train intensively for a big race or big event, their target event. They do that and then they get lots of downtime afterwards, and it's that cycle. There's not many horses over there that are kept perhaps in, you know, moderate or hard levels of training and work for such long periods as we would typically see in the UK, you know, and that may be something, a way of helping us to manage our horses here better, because they don't typically see so many ulcers in Australia. And that was very much anecdotal, people chatting, but it just makes you think, oh, I wonder if that's a model we could try with some of these horses that are not responding or coping very well when it comes to EGGD. I I think, again, we say, oh, turn out if you possibly can, but we do have to be aware that some horses are actually quite stressed by being turned out, particularly if it's groups or animals, say they're getting bullied in a group, or their friend isn't turned out when they're turned out. So we do have to try and think that, yes, okay, turnout is a logical thing to want to do, but are they truly happy there, and could we improve the situation for them by putting them in a different paddock or giving them a different turnout time or regime compared to some of the other horses. Again, it's very difficult to perhaps do this in practice, but minimising the number of different people handling your horse can be helpful. Chatting to some of the behaviourists, you know, and it's the same, I guess, with children and how we interact with one another. Some of us have, you know, very clear boundaries, how much personal space we want. And if if you're a horse and you've got different people coming in because it's the different student group coming to muck you out today or whatever, or a different groom comes in on Saturdays to look after you, you know, the boundaries that you've established with the person that normally sees you could be very different to the person that comes in at the weekends. And that actually can be quite stressful for the horse, and certainly seems to be relating to a risk factor for EGGD as well. And yeah, those other things, the good practice that Tina talked about, feeding top fibre before you exercise and travel is key. Some other considerations I just wanted to highlight really in terms of making the case for the use of alfalfa is that some preliminary work that actually indicates when you're feeding omeprazole over a longer term, it is potentially reducing the calcium absorption. It's something that we see in humans if people are on omeprazole over the long term as well. And whether or not it's sufficient to actually result in things like bone demineralization, I don't think we're anywhere near concluding that that is definitely the case, but it's certainly something that's talked about if you're using omeprazole for the long term in racing, especially with the immature sort of 2-3-year-olds where their calcium requirement is even greater. And just to put it into context, you know, just one scoop of a pure alfalfa fibre feed is actually giving a 500 kilo horse about 1/5 of their daily calcium requirement. So you can easily compensate for some of that reduction in calcium absorption if you need to. Just one slide on some of the products. We've always had the sort of stereotype of the poor doer horse that has ulcers. So most of the products that we first launched were higher in calories, but following that study I showed you survey at the start, where really started to acknowledge that ulcers is a problem for a wide range of horses and ponies, including good doers and those that are overweight. The most recent sort of ulcer product in our range is definitely the low calorie one. So it's taking all the goodies, the things that we add to try and provide some gastric support, but it's just utilising straw and grass in the chopped sort of form with some alfalfa pellets with some natural buffering to try and bring the calorie value down, but still keep that benefit of alfalfa, which is the buffering. This I just think is a bit of fun, and it's it's quite tricky to explain, but there was a journalist in the US and she devised or developed a risk calculator, and some Italian researchers wanted to see whether it was accurate or not. So she's gone through all the risk factors for ulcers, kind of given them a weighting so that you tick the box if those things apply to your horse, and it would give you a sort of risk. It's not a diagnostic tool, which I cannot stress highly enough, but what it is really just showing is the environment, the things you're doing for your horse, actually creating a high risk situation for gastric ulcers. And the Italian researchers basically got horses that they were scoping in their clinic they scoped them, they asked the owners to do the questionnaire, and it was really quite accurate. So for the low risk, those that came out as low risk, only 14% had ulcers. For the medium risk, around 45% had ulcers, and for the high risk, 94% had ulcers. So we've developed a similar one, which is on our website. Again, it's not a diagnostic tool, it's just there for you to explore the different risk factors for ulcers, look at what the cumulative effect of different things might be, and you're welcome to have a go and just see. It's quite a useful tool to look at your individual situation, really. And then my last couple of slides really are on the BETA approval mark, which is highlighting the products that are suitable for horses and ponies prone to gastric ulcers. So what does this mark actually mean and involve? And the important thing to stress is that it is an independent assessment of feeds. So it has to go in front of the Veterinary Medicines Directorate. They are a government agency, so they are basically not going to endorse anything that is making any sort of claim to treat, cure or prevent diseases such as ulcers. They are purely looking for products that by means of their composition and what they've got in them are going to be low risk for things like gastric ulcers. And it's probably why some companies don't bother applying for it, because they want the freedom to make stronger claims. So it's often about what isn't in there rather than what is in there. So a feed should never treat, cure, or prevent disease in the sense of a claim. You know, there's a lot of reasons why pharmaceutical companies invest millions in creating medicines. And rightly, it's really important that we don't set out other products that haven't been tested in the same way as being potentially medicinal. All we are about is trying to reduce the risk. So it's good feeding management, and that's what this mark is about. If you want a low risk product, then this is the one that, you know, or this mark is what you should be looking for. Now, the criteria is that we have to provide less than 2 grams of starch per kilo body weight per day and 1 gram per meal. And that's the level that most nutritionists will work to as being a perceived sort of upper limit. Okay, so by the way of when we analyse the feeds, the feeding rates, when we look at it, then those feeds that are approved won't go above those levels. So that's the sort of rationale behind it.